On the 15th of January, 1919, a wave of molasses 2 stories high moved through a Boston neighborhood at the speed of a galloping horse. It sounds like a joke. It killed 21 people, and it is one of the most genuine industrial disasters this channel has ever reconstructed. This is what happened. In the north end of Boston, on the waterfront, stood a giant tank owned by an industrial company. It held molasses, thick, heavy, dark molasses, millions of liters of it. The molasses was an industrial raw material used to produce alcohol, including alcohol for industrial purposes. On a mild January day, that tank failed, all at once, completely, and released its entire contents into the streets of a crowded neighborhood as a moving wave of liquid that crushed buildings and swept away everyone in its path. This is Post-Mortem. We don't sensationalize, we reconstruct. Tonight, the disaster that the world remembers as almost comic, and that was, in fact, a textbook industrial catastrophe, and the chain of shortcuts, missing engineering, and absent regulation that turned a storage tank into a weapon. We're going to walk it the way an investigator walks it. The tank, the shortcuts that built it, the years of warnings, the mild January day, the wave, and the way this disaster helped force engineering itself to grow up. To understand the disaster, you have to understand the tank. And to understand the tank, you have to understand why it was built in a hurry. The tank belonged to an industrial company in the business of producing alcohol. Molasses was the raw material. Molasses can be fermented and distilled into alcohol. And the company needed a large quantity of molasses on hand at its Boston waterfront site, so it had a giant storage tank built to hold it. The tank was an enormous cylinder of steel, tall, wide, holding when full an immense quantity of liquid in the region of many millions of liters. It was built of curved steel plates, riveted together in courses, one ring of plates above another, rising to its full great height. And it was built quickly, under commercial pressure, because the company wanted it in service. The molasses business had its rhythms and its demands, and the tank was wanted in operation as soon as it could be made to hold liquid. A large steel structure holding millions of liters, built fast under commercial pressure. Hold that because every word of it matters. Now I have to describe the state of engineering practice for a structure like this in the years around 1915, because the gap between what was done and what should have been done is the entire story. By any modern standard, the building of a giant liquid storage tank is a serious engineering undertaking. You calculate the loads. You calculate the pressure the liquid exerts on the walls, which is greatest at the bottom where the column of liquid above is tallest. You specify steel of adequate strength and thickness with a generous margin of safety. You ensure the design is reviewed by qualified engineers. And when the tank is built, you test it carefully before you trust it, typically by filling it with water and watching how it behaves. Water testing matters for a specific reason. Water is heavier than molasses, so a tank filled with water is tested under a load even greater than the molasses it will hold. And if the tank leaks or fails during a water test, you have lost only water harmlessly, instead of losing your dangerous or valuable contents into the street. The proper building of this tank called for adequate steel, competent engineering oversight, and a real test before it was trusted with millions of liters. The tank in Boston's North End received, by the weight of the evidence, Far too little of all three. Here is what the investigation that followed the disaster found about how the tank had actually been built. The steel of the tank walls was, for the loads it had to carry, too thin. The structure did not have the margin of strength that a tank of that size holding that weight of liquid required. The construction itself, the riveting, the joining of the steel plates, was not of the quality the structure needed. And the project had not had the proper, competent engineering oversight that a major load-bearing structure demands. The person principally responsible for the tank on the company's side was not, by the account that emerged, an engineer qualified to design and supervise such a structure. And the design was not properly checked by people who were. And the tank, when it was finished, was not properly tested. It was not subjected to a thorough water test that would have revealed its weakness safely, with only water to lose. By the account that emerged, it was put into service and filled with molasses with only a token check or less of its integrity. So the tank that stood over the north end of Boston was, from the day it was completed, an inadequate structure, too thin, built without proper oversight, untested, and then trusted again and again with millions of liters of liquid and the lives of everyone who lived and worked around it. The tank did not fail the day it was filled. It stood and it held molasses for a period of years before the disaster. And it would be easy to assume from that there was no warning. There was a great deal of warning. From early in its service life, the tank leaked. Molasses seeped from its seams, from the riveted joints between the steel plates. The leaking was not a secret. It was visible. Molasses ran down the outside of the tank. The neighborhood around the tank knew it leaked. There is an account, which has become part of the permanent story of this disaster, that local people would collect the leaking molasses, that children would gather it. Whether or not every detail of that account is exact, the core of it is well supported, and it tells you what you need to know. The tank was visibly, persistently leaking its contents in plain sight for years. Now, I want to be precise about what a leak from a steel tank means, because this is where the disaster's deepest engineering lesson begins. A leak from the riveted seam of a steel tank is not just a loss of product, it is a symptom. It is the structure telling you that the joints are working, that the seams are stressed, that the tank is not as sound as it should be. A tank that leaks at its seams is a tank that is, in a quiet voice, reporting its own distress. The leaking of the Boston tank was a warning, delivered continuously for years in a form anyone could see. And the company's response to that warning is one of the hardest parts of this story to absorb. The leaking was treated, in effect, as a maintenance nuisance and a cosmetic problem rather than as a structural alarm. By the account that emerged from the investigation, the tank was at one point painted a dark color, a color close to that of molasses, which had the effect, whether intended or not, of making the dark leaks far less visible against the wall. Think about what that means. The structure was sending a distress signal, and the response, instead of answering the distress, was to make the signal harder to see. There were also human warnings, voices, not just the silent evidence of the leaks. By the accounts that came out after the disaster, there were people who looked at the tank with unease, employees, residents, people who saw the leaking and the way the structure behaved and were not reassured. There were rumbling, groaning sounds from the tank that were noticed, but the structure of the situation worked against those warnings being acted upon, And it worked against them in a way this channel has seen before. In the Piper Alpha episode, I described how workers with legitimate safety concerns did not always raise them through formal channels because they feared for their standing and their jobs. In the Bhopal episode, I described a workforce that sensed its plant was being run down. The Boston tank existed in an even harsher environment for a warning. It was an era, around 1915, of very little construction regulation. There was no robust system of independent inspection that would have caught a structurally inadequate tank. There was no clear, powerful channel through which an uneasy worker or a worried neighbor could compel an examination of the structure. The warnings existed. The leaks were visible for years. The unease was real. But there was no machinery, no regulation, no inspection regime, no protected channel to convert that warning into an inspection and an inspection into a repair. The tank reported its own distress continuously to a world that had built no way to listen. The 15th of January, 1919 was, for Boston in January, a relatively mild day. I want to draw attention to that because the temperature is part of the story. The preceding days had been cold, as Boston winters are. The 15th was noticeably warmer, a mild day after cold ones. And there is one more fact about the days before the disaster that matters. Not long before, the tank had been filled, topped up close to its capacity with a fresh, large quantity of molasses. So, on the 15th of January, the tank was holding a very large load, close to full, and it was holding it through a swing in temperature from cold to mild. The investigation and the analysis that followed considered how these conditions, a near-full tank, the weight of the liquid, the warming after cold weather, possible effects on the molasses and on the steel, bore on the failure. The detailed mechanics were studied and debated for a very long time. But the central, simple fact does not depend on the fine detail. On the 15th of January, an inadequate, too thin, untested tank was holding close to its full load. And an inadequate structure under a heavy load does not need a dramatic trigger to fail. It only needs the day on which its hidden weakness finally gives way. At around 12:30 in the early afternoon of the 15th of January, 1919, the tank failed. And it did not fail slowly. It did not develop a worsening leak that gave people time to run. The structure of the tank gave way catastrophically and almost instantaneously. The steel walls came apart. The riveted seams that had been weeping for years tore open along their length, and the tank essentially burst, the whole structure failing at once, the steel plates ripping away and being flung outward, some of them with great force. And the entire contents of the tank, millions of liters of heavy molasses, were released into the surrounding streets in a single moment with nothing to contain them and nothing to slow them. What was released was not a spreading puddle. It was a wave. I have to describe the wave carefully, because the wave is the thing that makes this disaster real rather than absurd. And the wave is the thing that killed 21 people. When millions of liters of heavy liquid are released all at once with no containment, the liquid does not gently spread. It collapses outward under its own weight. And at the front of that collapsing mass, it forms a moving wall, a wave. The wave of molasses that came out of the tank was, by the accounts of the disaster, a moving wall of liquid of considerable height. Estimates describe it in the region of several meters tall at its front, a wave taller than a person, taller than a room, and it was moving fast. The front of the wave moved through the streets at a speed often described as comparable to a galloping horse, far faster than a human being can run. Now combine those two things. A wall of liquid meters high, moving faster than anyone could flee. That is not a flood in the ordinary slow sense. That is an impact. The molasses wave hit the neighborhood the way a wall of water from a failed dam hits a valley. And there is one more property that made it lethal. Molasses is dense. It is heavy. A given volume of molasses weighs far more than the same volume of water. So the wave was not only tall and fast, it was a wall of unusually heavy liquid, and it carried in its moving mass an enormous amount of force. The wave moved through the North End waterfront, and what it did in seconds. It struck buildings and damaged or destroyed them. Structures were knocked from their foundations, wrecked, swept. It struck the elevated railway structure that ran through the area and damaged its supports. It overturned and carried away vehicles and carts. And it struck the people who were in the streets and in the buildings on an ordinary working afternoon. Workers, residents, people passing through on the waterfront, going about the middle of their day. 21 people were killed by the Boston molasses flood. Around 150 more were injured. I want to be plain about how the molasses killed, because the manner of it is part of why this disaster, for all its strange-sounding premise, was a genuine horror. The wave killed by impact, by the sheer physical force of a heavy, fast-moving wall of liquid striking people and striking the buildings they were in. And it killed because molasses, once it had knocked a person down and engulfed them, was a thick, heavy, clinging substance that a person caught in it could not simply swim or climb out of. The density and the stickiness that made the wave so destructive also made it, for someone trapped in it, terribly difficult to escape. The rescue effort that followed the Boston molasses flood faced a problem unlike almost any other disaster this channel has reconstructed. The disaster site was, quite literally, flooded with a thick, heavy, sticky liquid. The molasses lay deep across the streets, in and around the wrecked buildings, coating everything. And that single physical fact made the rescue extraordinarily, cruelly difficult. To search the wreckage, to reach trapped and injured people, to recover those who had died, rescuers had to work in and through deep molasses. Every movement was resisted by the clinging weight of the liquid. People searching for survivors waded and struggled through it. The molasses dragged at their legs, coated their hands, fouled their tools. The work that would have been hard in any disaster, searching collapsed buildings, freeing trapped people, was made grueling and slow by the substance that lay over the entire scene. A rescue is always a race. The Boston molasses flood was a race run by people wading through the very thing that had caused the disaster. Help came to the North End from across the city. Emergency workers responded. Personnel from a naval vessel in the harbor came to assist with the rescue. Medical help was brought. Ordinary Bostonians came to dig, to wade, to carry the injured, to do the labor of a rescue. The work of searching the disaster site, of recovering all of the dead, went on for a considerable time because the molasses made every part of it slow. And the molasses did not vanish when the rescue was over. The cleanup of the North End, the removal of an enormous quantity of molasses from the streets, the buildings, the wreckage of an entire neighborhood, was itself a long and laborious effort. There are accounts, part of the lasting memory of the disaster, of the North End remaining sticky for a long time afterward, of the molasses being tracked through the city, of the smell of it lingering in the neighborhood. The disaster lasted seconds. The wave moved through the streets in seconds, but the Molasses flood, like the chemical contamination in the Bhopal episode, did not have a clean ending. It lingered. It clung to the neighborhood it had wrecked, physically, for a long time after the 21 were dead. I want to mark the responders here, the way this channel marks them in every episode. The people who waded into the molasses to search for survivors did one of the most physically miserable rescue jobs imaginable. There was nothing dramatic about it, no fire to outface, no explosion to brave. There was only deep, cold, clinging, exhausting liquid and the knowledge that somewhere in it people were trapped. The sailors, the emergency workers, the volunteers who did that work did it anyway, hour after hour, dragging themselves through the substance that had killed the people they were trying to reach. In every disaster this channel reconstructs, there is a thin line of people who turn toward the wreckage when everyone else is turning away. At Texas City, that line was a fire department. At Piper Alpha, it was the crews of small boats. In the north end of Boston, on a cold afternoon in 1919, it was a crowd of people wading into a flood of molasses. The form changes. The thing itself, ordinary people doing the hard, grim work of helping, does not. After the Boston molasses flood, something happened that gives this disaster a special place in the history of industrial accidents. It went to court, and the court case became one of the most thorough public investigations of an engineering failure that had, up to that time, ever been conducted. The victims of the disaster and their families brought legal claims against the company that owned the tank. And the company, in its defense, advanced an explanation for the disaster that this channel has met before in a different episode. The company argued that the tank had not failed because it was badly built. The company argued, in effect, that the tank had been destroyed by a deliberate act, that someone had set off an explosive device or otherwise sabotaged the structure. In the Bhopal episode, you will remember, the company at the center of that disaster also, in the years afterward, advanced a theory of deliberate sabotage to explain how water had entered the tank. The pattern is worth noticing. When a company's own structure or plant fails catastrophically, the explanation that places the cause outside the company, in the hands of a saboteur, is an explanation with obvious appeal to that company. And in Boston, as in Bhopal, that explanation had to be tested against the physical evidence. The legal proceeding that followed the disaster was long, and it was detailed, and it heard a great deal of expert testimony. Engineers and experts examined the question of why the tank had failed. They examined the steel. They examined the design, the thinness of the walls, the quality of the construction, the absence of proper engineering oversight, the absence of a proper test. They weighed the company's claim of sabotage against the physical evidence of the structure itself. And the conclusion that the proceeding reached, the conclusion the weight of the evidence supported, was clear, and it has been the accepted understanding of the disaster ever since. The tank had not been destroyed by sabotage. The tank had failed because it was structurally inadequate. It was too thin, built of steel not equal to the task, constructed without competent engineering oversight, never properly tested, and overloaded relative to what such a flawed structure could safely bear. The disaster was an engineering failure, and the responsibility lay with the company that had built and operated an unsound tank. The company was found liable, and the victims and their families were, through the legal process, awarded compensation. The court did what the absent regulators had failed to do. After the fact, and at the cost of 21 lives, it forced an accounting. I want to lay out the causes of the Boston Molasses flood the way this channel always does, as a chain, link by link, and then I want to tell you something remarkable, which is that engineers were still studying this disaster and learning from it many decades after it happened. The chain. The first link is commercial pressure. A company wanted a large molasses tank in service quickly to support its alcohol business. The second link is the failure of competent engineering. The tank was designed and overseen without the qualified engineering attention a major load-bearing structure demands. The design was not properly checked. The third link is the inadequate structure itself. The steel of the walls was too thin for the loads, and the steel and the construction were not equal to the task. The fourth link is the absence of testing. The tank was not subjected to a proper water test that would have revealed its weakness safely before it was ever trusted with millions of liters of molasses. The fifth link is the ignored warning. The tank leaked visibly at its seams for years, a continuous structural distress signal, and the response was to treat it as a cosmetic nuisance, even to paint the tank a dark color that hid the leaks. And the sixth link, beneath all the others, is the absence of regulation. There was, in that era, no robust system of independent inspection and construction control that would have caught the inadequate tank, compelled its repair, or prevented its being built that way at all. Now here is the remarkable part. For a long time after 1919, the precise physical and mechanical details of how the tank failed, the exact behavior of the steel, the exact role of the temperature, the exact way the rupture propagated, remained a subject that engineers and scientists returned to. And in the modern era, with modern understanding of materials, researchers have revisited the Boston Molasses flood and analyzed it with the tools of contemporary engineering. That later analysis has added depth to the understanding of the disaster, examining, for instance, the properties of the steel that was used, the way that steel might behave at the temperatures involved, and the way the heavy liquid would have flowed through the streets. The disaster has been treated, decades after the fact, as a serious case study in materials engineering and in the behavior of failing structures. I find that genuinely moving, and I want to say why. A disaster that the public has often remembered as a kind of joke, the Great Molasses Flood, has been taken seriously enough by engineers across an entire century that they have kept studying it, kept extracting lessons from it, kept letting 21 deaths in 1919 teach the engineers of 100 years later. That is what it looks like when a disaster's lesson is genuinely kept alive. In the Texas City episode, I warned about lessons being allowed to decay. The Boston Molasses flood is, in its strange way, the opposite. A disaster whose lesson the engineering profession has refused to let go of. The Boston Molasses flood did not leave the world of construction unchanged. No disaster of this magnitude ever does, and the changes it helped bring about are, in a sense, the most fundamental that this channel has ever described, because they go to the very idea of who is allowed to build a large structure and on what conditions. The disaster and the long, public, detailed legal proceeding that followed it helped to drive home a lesson that the early 20th century was, across many places, in the process of learning. The lesson was that the building of large structures cannot be left to the unchecked discretion of the people who want them built. In the decades around and after the Molasses flood, the regime governing construction tightened. The expectation grew and was increasingly written into law that significant structures must be designed by qualified engineers, that their plans must be reviewed and approved by competent, independent authorities, and that the people responsible for designing and certifying structures must themselves be qualified and accountable. The professional licensing of engineers, the formal review of building plans, the inspection of construction, the whole apparatus that now stands between a person's desire to build something large and the actual building of it grew stronger in this era. The Molasses flood was one of the disasters that demonstrated, in the most vivid possible way, why that apparatus needed to exist. I want to draw out the specific engineering lesson too, because it is sharper than just better regulation. The molasses tank failed catastrophically and all at once. It did not fail gracefully, and the warning it gave, the leaking seams, was a warning that the structure's character made easy to dismiss as a nuisance. One of the lessons the disaster reinforced is the importance of testing a structure safely before trusting it with a dangerous load. The water test, the principle of proving a tank with harmless water so that if it fails safely. Another is the importance of reading a structure's distress signals correctly, of understanding that a leak at a seam is not a cosmetic problem but a structural report, and that the correct response to a structure reporting distress is to investigate it, not to paint over it. And the deepest engineering lesson is the one this channel has reached before. A large structure holding a heavy load contains, stored within it, an enormous amount of energy. The energy of all that mass held up against gravity. As long as the structure holds, that energy is invisible and harmless. When the structure fails, that energy is released. The molasses tank was, in the most literal sense, a vast store of potential energy standing over a crowded neighborhood. The wave that killed 21 people was simply that stored energy, let loose in a few seconds by a structure that should never have been trusted to hold it. And there is a legacy in the legal and human dimension too, beyond the engineering. The legal proceeding that followed the molasses flood was a case in which ordinary people, the injured and the families of the dead, people of a working waterfront neighborhood, were able, through the courts, to hold the company accountable for an industrial disaster and to obtain compensation. In an era before strong regulation, the lawsuit was the mechanism of justice and the mechanism of investigation at once. It was, in that sense, a demonstration that an industrial company could be made to answer, in detail and in public, for the catastrophic failure of its own structure. As in every episode of this channel, none of the change that came afterward, the tighter construction regulation, the engineering licensing, the principle of independent review, the accountability, none of it happened because industry, left alone, decided to do better. It happened because a wave of molasses, 2 stories high, moved through a Boston neighborhood at the speed of a galloping horse, killed 21 people, and could not, despite how strange it sounded, be laughed away. I want to spend a scene, near the end, on something that sets the Boston molasses flood apart from every other disaster this channel reconstructs. The way the world remembers it. Piper Alpha is remembered as a horror. Bhopal is remembered as a horror. Chernobyl, the Hindenburg, Texas City. The world remembers these as the catastrophes they were. The Boston molasses flood is remembered, very often, as a curiosity, as an oddity, as an almost comic footnote, the time a city was flooded with molasses. The premise of it sounds absurd, and the absurdity has, for a century, partly obscured the disaster underneath. And I think it is worth saying clearly, on a channel devoted to disaster forensics, why that matters and why it is wrong. 21 people died in the north end of Boston on the 15th of January, 1919. They were workers and residents, caught on an ordinary afternoon by a wall of heavy liquid moving faster than they could run. They were crushed by impact and trapped in a substance they could not escape. Around 150 more were injured. A neighborhood was wrecked. The manner of those deaths was not comic. It was terrifying, and it was painful, and it was real. The reason the Boston Molasses flood deserves to be reconstructed seriously and not told as a joke is that underneath the strange-sounding premise, it is one of the cleanest, most instructive industrial disasters in the entire record. Strip away the oddity of the substance, and what you have is a textbook. A company under commercial pressure. A major structure built too thin, without competent engineering, without proper oversight. No real test before the structure was trusted. Years of visible warning in the form of leaks, ignored, and even concealed. No regulation to catch any of it. And then catastrophic, sudden failure, and the release of an enormous store of energy onto the people who happen to be nearby. That chain, commercial pressure, absent engineering, no testing, ignored warnings, no regulation, sudden release, is the chain of a serious industrial disaster. It is the same shape in its bones as disasters that killed far more people. The molasses is what makes it sound funny. The molasses is not what makes it matter. What makes it matter is that it is a near-perfect specimen of how an industrial structure kills people and a near-perfect demonstration of why the engineering profession and the law had to grow up. In the north end of Boston today, where the Great Tank once stood, there is a marker. It records the Boston Molasses flood, and it remembers the 21 people who died there on the 15th of January, 1919. The neighborhood long ago recovered and was rebuilt, and the waterfront of the North End is a living part of the city, but the disaster is not forgotten there. The marker keeps the date and the deaths in the place where they happened, and the disaster lives on too, in the lecture halls of engineering schools, studied a century later as a genuine case in materials and in structural failure, the lessons of 21 deaths still being taught to people who will design the tanks and the structures of the future. That is the truth that Post-Mortem keeps returning to, and it is the truth I want to leave you with tonight. A storage tank, like a chemical plant, like a reactor, like an airship, like a bridge, like a cargo ship, is a promise. It is a promise made to every person who lives and works within reach of it that the people who built it understood what they were building and built it to hold. The molasses tank in Boston's North End was a promise made carelessly. It was built too thin by a company in a hurry, without competent engineering, without a proper test, and then it was trusted for years against the evidence of its own leaking seams with millions of liters of liquid and the lives of an entire neighborhood. The promise was hollow from the day the tank was finished, and on a mild January afternoon, the promise simply gave way. None of the change that came afterward, the tighter construction regulation, the engineering licensing, the independent review of plans, the principle of testing a structure before you trust it, none of it happened because industry, left alone, decided to do better. It happened because 21 people died under a wave of molasses, and because, in the end, the world refused to let the strangeness of that wave obscure the seriousness of why it came. Thank you for sitting with this one. If reconstructions like this matter to you, subscribe. The channel is here for them.